Resident Evil 9 Requiem is a story about the lingering scars of the Raccoon City disaster. Through the investigation of Grace Ashcroft and the experience of veteran agent Leon Kennedy, the game explores how Umbrella's experiments reshape the world and how the past refuses to stay buried. The nightmare never truly ended, it simply waited, and that is what makes Requiem so important. Resident Evil 9 does not just add another chapter to the lore, it quietly reconnects every major timeline in the franchise back to one man, Oswell E. Spencer. To understand why Resident Evil 9 matters, you first have to understand what Requiem is doing on the surface. Then, you have to understand the buried history underneath it. On the surface, Resident Evil Requiem is returning to the DNA of the franchise. It brings the story back to the aftermath of Raccoon City, the original public catastrophe that changed the world forever. It introduces a new protagonist, Grace Ashcroft, an FBI intelligence analyst, investigating a series of deaths connected to that disaster. It also brings back Leon S. Kennedy, no longer the rookie police officer from 1998, but a veteran anti-bioterror agent whose entire life has been shaped by the consequences of Umbrella's work. That is why Requiem feels different from a normal sequel. It does not feel like just another outbreak. It feels like a return, and more than that, a reckoning. Resident Evil 9 is not interested in simply moving forward. It is interested in turning around, looking back, and forcing the franchise to confront the disaster that defined it. It is a story about aftermath, inheritance, and the biological consequences of a history that never actually ended. And that is what makes Requiem so important. Before we can understand what the story means for the franchise, we first have to understand what Resident Evil 9 is actually doing on the surface. Grace and Leon are the perfect pair for this story because they represent two different ways of carrying the past. Grace inherits it, Leon remembers it, and that difference is exactly what gives Resident Evil 9 its emotional weight. Grace Ashcroft is an FBI intelligence analyst and the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, a survivor of the Raccoon City incident. That already makes her important, because Grace belongs to the generation that did not live through Umbrella's greatest public catastrophe firsthand, but still grew up in the shadow of it. Her life was shaped by what happened in 1998, even though she was not there when the city fell. Grace is assigned to investigate the latest in a rash of mysterious deaths at the abandoned Redwood Hotel in the Midwest, the same place where her mother was murdered 8 years earlier. So Grace is not in Raccoon City at the start of the game. She begins at Redwood. But the deeper she digs into the case, the clearer it becomes that Redwood is only the doorway. The real trail leads backwards, towards the survivors of Raccoon City and the buried biological consequences of the original outbreak. Leon S. Kennedy is there for the opposite reason. Leon does not inherit the nightmare secondhand. He lived through it. He is one of the original survivors of the Raccoon City incident, and by the time of Requiem, he has spent decades working as a DSO operative, responding to biohazard events around the world. Leon is pulled into the Redwood case after a police officer goes missing there. On paper, that is his reason for entering the story. On a deeper level, Leon is there because this is exactly the kind of case his life has prepared him to recognize. A quiet scene, a missing officer, a mysterious death, and signs that point towards old biohazard patterns. He knows what it means when the dead start leading back toward Umbrella again. Later, as the conspiracy opens up, Leon follows the trail of Grace, Gideon, and Elpis back towards the ruin of Raccoon City itself. For Grace, Raccoon City is unfinished truth. For Leon, it is unfinished trauma. Grace is discovering the truth. Leon has been surviving it for nearly 30 years. And once you understand who Grace and Leon are, the story of Requiem stops feeling like a simple investigation and starts feeling like something much heavier. A return to the place where this nightmare first learned how to survive. Resident Evil Requiem begins with a death, but it never feels like it is only about one victim. The story opens at the abandoned Redwood Hotel in the American Midwest, where a body has surfaced as part of a mysterious chain of deaths. Grace Ashcroft is assigned to investigate the case at the same hotel where her mother was murdered. When a police officer goes missing at the scene, Leon S. Kennedy is dispatched as well. Redwood is not just a location, it is the emotional doorway into the entire game. For Grace, this is not simply another federal assignment. It is a return to the place where her life was divided into before and after. Requiem immediately makes it clear that this is a story about inheritance. Grace is not just investigating a crime, she is walking into the unfinished aftermath of one. As Grace begins following the trail, the case rapidly stops feeling local. The death at Renwood appears tied to the biological fall of Raccoon City. Leon's arrival raises the stakes even further because his appearance tells the audience what kind of story this really is. If Grace is there because the case is personal, Leon is there because the case has begun to resemble a biohazard. From there, the story turns violent. Victor Gideon pulls Grace into the conspiracy surrounding Elpis, and the game shifts from the investigation into captivity and survival horror. The narrative expands from one abandoned hotel into a much larger hidden system of sealed facilities, hidden experiments, and infected corridors. That larger system eventually leads into Rhodes Hill, where the dual structure of the story becomes visible. Grace experiences the world as vulnerability, fear, and confusion. Leon experiences it as recognition. He has seen too many versions of this kind of place before. A building that pretends to serve life while quietly becoming a factory for biological disaster. This is also where the emotional center of the story shapens through Emily. Before Emily, Grace is chasing answers. After Emily, Grace is trying to save someone. Elpis stops being an abstract project at that point. It becomes personal. As the story progresses, the old world and the new world begin collapsing together. Leon and Grace eventually reach Ark, a hidden umbrella laboratory where Gideon and Zeno are both pursuing Elpis and believe Grace is somehow the key to obtaining it. The game begins with a single body in a dead hotel, but its real destination is buried umbrella infrastructure. Ark is where the central truth of Requiem finally comes into focus. Grace reaches the Elpis terminal and is forced into a choice: destroy Elpis or release it. In the dark ending, Leon dies, the facility collapses, and the cure is lost. In the true ending, Elpis is revealed to be an antiviral cure. Grace uses it on Leon. Zeno's misunderstanding of Elpis destroys him, and Gideon mutates into the final major monster. That is why the full story of Resident Evil 9 matters so much. On the surface, it is about Grace investigating a body at the Renwood Hotel and being dragged into a buried conspiracy. Underneath that, it is about what happens when the past comes back for the people who thought they escaped it. But the deeper truth of Requiem is that it is not just telling one more Resident Evil story. It is quietly pulling every major thread in the franchise back to the same knot. Resident Evil 9 is not important just because it gives the series another outbreak, another hidden lab, or another new mystery. What makes Requiem so powerful is that it does something much bigger than adding more lore. It reconnects the lore that was already there. It takes decades of Resident Evil history that often felt scattered across different characters, different viruses, different organizations, and even different styles of horror, and reveals that those pieces were never as separate as they seemed. For years, Resident Evil could be experienced in fragments. The early games looked like the Umbrella story. Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 looked like the global bioterror story. Resident Evil 7 and Village looked like the mode story. More intimate, more psychological, and more removed from the old pharmaceutical conspiracy atmosphere. On the surface, those eras often feel like different branches of the same franchise. Requiem changes that perspective. It makes them feel like one continuous chain of consequences. It does that first by returning to Raccoon City, not just as a nostalgic setting, but as an active source of unfinished damage. Earlier games treated Raccoon City as the original catastrophe, the defining trauma that launched the franchise into public biohazard horror. Requiem reframes it as something even worse. The city was not simply a terrible event that ended in 1998. It was the start of a long biological echo. The city did not just die, it kept radiating consequences outwards through survivors, bloodlines, memory, and latent infection. That one shift changes the meaning of the whole franchise. Once Raccoon City stops being backstory and starts being unfinished history, everything connected to it begins to matter in a new way. Leon is no longer just a returning hero. He becomes living evidence that the original wound never closed. Grace is no longer just a new protagonist. She becomes proof that the next generation is still being shaped by Umbrella's past. Sherry is no longer just a callback to Resident Evil 2. She becomes one of the clearest examples of a body that has been carrying the consequences of old science for years. Requiem, Requiem reconnects the franchise not only through characters but through ideas. At the center of almost every major Resident Evil era is the same obsession, the desire to control evolution through biology. That idea starts with Spencer and Progenitor. It continues through the T virus, G virus, Tyrants, Project W, Las Plagas, Boros, the C virus, and eventually the mold. The forms change, the organisms change, the methods change, but the deeper ambitions stay the same. Again and again, Resident Evil returns to the same dangerous belief that life can be rewritten, that humanity can be improved, filtered, elevated, or weaponized through infections. That is why Requiem matters so much. It is the chapter where the franchise finally shows that these are not separate obsessions belonging to separate villains. They are all mutations of the same original worldview. Spencer believed Progenitor was the key to human evolution. Umbrella turned that belief into industrial science. Birkin turned it into unstable mutation. Wesker turned it into selective transcendence. The bioterror era turned it into a global marketplace. The mold era turned it into memory, identity, and biological inheritance. Requiem pulls all of that back into one frame and says this was always the same story. This is also why the game's title feels so deliberate. A requiem is not just an ending, it is an act of remembrance, a reckoning with the dead. Requiem is not simply giving us new plot information, it is forcing the series to remember itself. Umbrella not just as a corporation, but as the original machine of biological ambition. Raccoon City not just as a disaster, but as the wound that shaped everything after it. Leon not just as a protagonist, but as one of the last living witnesses of the first age of horror. in the survivors' experiments, bloodlines, and institutions that keep carrying Umbrella science forward after Umbrella itself collapsed. Once the game makes all those connections visible, Resident Evil stops looking like a collection of outbreaks and starts looking like one long, unfinished experiment, one disaster feeding the next, one ideology surviving inside new organizations, one biological logic mutating through time, one nightmare wearing different faces in different eras, but always carrying the same DNA underneath. Requiem does not just continue the series, it reveals the connective tissue that has always been there. Oswell E. Spencer was never just a businessman. He was the architect of the entire biological worldview that shaped Resident Evil. More than anyone else, Spencer believed that humanity was flawed, weak, and unfinished. When he discovered the Progenitor Virus, he became convinced that biology itself held the key to forcing humanity into a new stage of existence. Spencer did not see viruses as random diseases. He saw them as filters. He believed they could separate the weak from the strong, kill most people, transform a few, and elevate the rare compatible survivors into something greater. In his mind, infection was not merely destruction, it was selection. That is why he became obsessed. Progenitor was not simply a scientific curiosity to him, it was proof that nature already contained the mechanisms for rewriting life. Spencer believed he had found the hidden code of human evolution. Once he believed that, everything else followed naturally. Umbrella, Project W, Tyrants, and the entire bioweapon industry all flow out of that one conviction. Because Spencer's obsession did not only shape corporations, viruses, and laboratories, it shaped people, families, bloodlines, and entire generations of lives rewritten by the science he set into motion. The legacy survives through people as much as through organizations. The Ashford family matters because Edward Ashford helped found Umbrella, and the later Ashford line pushes research into cloning, genetic selection, and T. Veronica. The Birkin line matters because William Birkins created G, and Sherry survives infection, becoming living proof that some bodies can endure and carry the consequences of bioweapon history forward. The Wesker line, through Project W, reveals Spencer's belief that superior humans could be engineered through selective programs. And the Winters family matters because Ethan and Rose bring the mode era into the bloodline conversation, showing that inheritance in Resident Evil is no longer just about viruses, it is about altered biology passed through family itself. The Ashfords are one of the oldest and most aristocrat families tied to Umbrella's origin. Edward Ashford was one of the three co-founders of Umbrella alongside Spencer and Marcus, which means the Ashford name is present at the birth of the entire franchise's nightmare. Later generations of the family, especially Alexander, Alfred, and Alexia Ashford, turned bloodline into obsession. Alexander attempted to restore the family's greatness through cloning and engineering heirs. Alexia, with her unnatural intelligence, created the T. Veronica virus using progenitor derived research and Queen Ant genetics. In the Ashford line, family becomes experiment, nobility becomes pathology. Their history matters because they show one branch of Umbrella's ideology turning inward, treating lineage itself as a laboratory. The Birkins family represents another kind of biology tragedy. William Birkins is one of the most important virologists in the series. The creator of the G virus, and a man whose ambition helped push umbrella science into one of its most grotesque forms. But the real emotional significance of the Birkins line is Sherry. As a child, she survives the Raccoon City incident and the horrors of her father's virus. That means she does not just remember the catastrophe, she carries it inside her body. Her biology becomes proof that some survivors do not leave the outbreak behind. They become part of its ongoing legacy. That is exactly why her presence in Requiem matters so much. The Wesker bloodline is less traditional family and more a manufactured lineage. Project W was Spencer's attempt to create superior humans through a eugenic style selection process, renaming successful child candidates with the Wesker surname. Albert Wesker is the most infamous result. But the project itself matters beyond him. It turns Bloodline into design. It proves that Spencer was not just interested in making viruses, he wanted to engineer the people most worthy of surviving them. In the Resident Evil universe, that is one of the darkest meanings of inheritance. Not only who you are born to, but whether someone powerful decides what you were born for. The Winter family brings all of that into the modern era. Ethan Winter begins as an ordinary outsider in Resident Evil 7, but through the mode and the events of Village, the Winters line becomes one of the most important biological inheritance in the modern franchise. Rosemary Winters, in particular, represents a new kind of legacy. She's not just a survivor's child, she is a child whose body and identity are bound up with a megamycete or megamycete, with a retained biological power, and with a future the series has only begun to explore. The easiest way to understand Resident Evil is to stop thinking of it as a pile of separate outbreaks and start thinking of it as three major eras of biological horror. Each era changes the kind of threat the series is dealing with, the science driving it, and the monsters that emerge from it. By the time Resident Evil 9 arrives, all three eras have bled into one another. The first era is the Umbrella era. This is the foundational age built on Spencer's obsession with progenitor and forced human evolution. Its defining threats are pregnant-derived viruses, especially the T virus and G virus. Its monsters are zombies, Cerberus, hunters, lickers, tyrants, nemesis, and giant mutated animals. The horror of this era is hidden catastrophe, secret labs, buried facilities, corporate secrecies, and one poisoned city. The second era is the bioterror era. This begins when Umbrella falls, but the science does not. Now, the question is no longer what one company is doing in secret, it is what happens when bioweapons become portable, tradable, and global. Las Plagas changes the series because the infected can retain intelligence and follow hierarchy. Boros turns evolution into filtration. The C virus pushes the world into industrialized biohazard warfare. The enemies of this era are the Ganados, the Magene, and the Guavos. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Parasite soldiers, adaptive, infected, reflect a world where bioweapons have escaped the lab and entered the marketplace of war. The third era is the mode era. Resident Evil 7 and Village do not replace the older lore, they expand the biological language of the franchise. Instead of focusing mainly on viruses and parasites, the series introduces the mode, also called the mutamycete, a fungal superorganism that can infect people, regenerate bodies, distort minds, and preserve memories, and connect living beings through biological networks. That is where Eveline becomes essential. Eveline is the first major mode BOW, a living weapon designed through the connections using Miranda's mode research and linked to the genetic legacy of Eva. She proves that the mold can be weaponized, but just as effectively as Umbrella once weaponized virus research. The monsters of this era, especially the molded and Miranda late mutants, feel more intimate and uncanny because the horror is no longer just mutation, it becomes identity, family, obsession, and biological presence. Village reveals the hidden historical connection that makes this era matter so much to the rest of the franchise. Spencer studied under Mother Miranda and took inspiration from what he found there. The old Umbrella nightmare and the modern mode nightmare are not separate stories. They are different branches of the same buried world view. The idea that biology can be used to rewrite humanity. By the time Requiem begins, Resident Evil is no longer a franchise that one company or one outbreak controls. It's a franchise about 60 years of evolving biological ambition. That is why Resident Evil 9 feels like a convergence point. Umbrella's hidden history begins long before the mansion incident, long before Raccoon City, and long before the public even knew bioweapons were real. In the late 1960s, Spencer Edward Ashford and James Marcus discovered the Progenitor Virus in Africa after pursuing legends surrounding the stairway to the sunflower. They did not simply find a rare pathogen, they found something they believed could alter life itself. Umbrella was founded in 1968 as the perfect cover for that research. A pharmaceutical company on the surface and a secret engine for the virus development underneath. That is the first truth people often miss about Umbrella. It was never created mainly to sell medicine. The public facing company was camouflage. The real purpose was money, infrastructure, secrecy, and political reach, all in service of virus research. Umbrella could build laboratories, move personnel, sponsor education, acquire land, influence governments, and bury dangerous experiments beneath the image of a health corporation. It was not just a business, it was a mask designed to make biological ambition look respectable. Spencer's role inside that machine is what makes Umbrella so different from any ordinary evil corporation. He was ideological. He believed the Progner virus could be refined into a tool that would separate humanity into the worthy and the disposable. On one level, Umbrella was building weapons, BOWs, tyrants, hunters, military products. On another level, Spencer was always chasing something bigger than warfare. He wanted to engineer the future of the species itself. The early structure of Umbrella reveals how layered it really was. Marcus pushed the scientific side, especially through the executive training school. The Ashford family gave the partnership prestige and aristocratic influence. Spencer sat above that, using the company to construct a system of facilities and research arms that could outlast any single scientist. Even at the beginning, Umbrella was not one lab. It was distributed network built for secrecy and expansion. One of the most sinister parts of Umbrella's hidden history is how quickly the founding partnership began to rot. Edward Ashford died after being infected with Progenitor. Marcus's work with leeches led towards the T virus, but his brilliance also made him inconvenient to Spencer. The moment Marcus became too independent, he became a threat to be removed. Umbrella did not just produce monsters and tanks, it destroyed the people inside it too. As Umbrella grew, it refined its research into multiple branches. The T virus became the backbone of its public bioweapon legacy, producing zombies, hunters, lickers, Cerberus, and tyrants. But those results were only the visible layer. Behind them, Umbrella was constantly testing how far life could be rewritten. It built facilities under seemingly normal spaces. The Spencer Mansion was not simply an eccentric estate, it was a cover for underground experimentations. Raccoon City itself became one of Umbrella's most important playgrounds, not by accident, but because civic influence, industrial cover, and hidden infrastructure could all overlap there. That link to Raccoon City is one of the most important pieces of Umbrella's hidden history. The city was not merely unlucky enough to sit near one lab, it was deeply entangled with Umbrella's operations. The company embedded itself into the region's economy, infrastructure, public image, and political networks. Raccoon City was the place where Umbrella's hidden life and public life finally collided so catastrophically that the mass could not survive it. Even the public destruction of Umbrella did not mean the true end of Umbrella's system. Once a corporation spends decades building viruses, programs, black budget research, military ties, covert logistics, and elite scientific cultures, those things do not simply vanish when the stock price dies. Umbrella collapsed as a corporation, but its science had already spread into rival companies, black markets, successor groups, and hidden facilities that would continue shaping the world long after the brand was disgraced. That is what makes Requiem's return to buried Umbrella infrastructure so meaningful. Arc is not frightening just because it is another hitting lab. It is frightening because it proves Umbrella's history was never fully excavated. There were still chambers underneath chambers, plans behind plans, and final projects that no one on the outside understood. Umbrella's hidden history is not just backstory, it is the buried skeleton holding up the entire franchise. Public lore around RE9 describes a condition often discussed as Raccoon City Syndrome, a latent evolved T virus condition tied to survivors of the 1998 outbreak. Some fans shorthand this as the Requiem strain, but the more accurate explanation is that RE9 revolves around a dormant mutated T virus lineage that remained in certain survivors and evolved over time. That idea alone is horrifying because it means the nightmare never disappeared, it remained dormant. That also helps explain why RE9's infected are more disturbing than classic zombies. Infected staff still act out fragments of their former routines, which makes them feel like bodies haunted by memory. Blister heads and Blisterborn reflect later stage mutations, while creatures like Chunk, Titan Spinner, and Gideon's final form show that Requiem's horror is active, layered, and still evolving. RE9 monsters are not random new additions, they're the latest symptoms of a lineage the franchise has been building for decades. Monsters are only part of the story. Behind every outbreak, every mutation, and every new horror, there are always people, institutions, and organizations carrying the science forward. The nightmare survives because it is never just biological, it is organizational. Somebody always funds it, studies it, hides it, sells it, or tries to stop it. Umbrella is the original source, the corporation that turned Spencer's ideology into infrastructure. It creates the template for everything that comes after. Biology industrialized, weaponized, and hidden behind public respectability. The BSAA matters because it represents the world's attempt to build an answer to the spread of bioweapons after Umbrella's fall. It begins as an anti-bioterror force, the institutional face of resistance. But later, lore complicates that role by hinting that even organizations built to stop bioweapons can be corrupted by the same logic they were created to fight. TerraSave matters because it offers a civilian and humanitarian response to the same world, where Umbrella represents exploitation and the BSAA represents armed resistance. TerraSave represents care for the survivors and victims crushed underneath the machinery of bioterror. Tricell matters because it proves that once Umbrella demonstrated bioweapons could be profitable, other corporations were always going to follow. Neo Umbrella matters because it weaponizes Umbrella's name and image long after the original company dies. The family matters because it reveals the influence of hidden elite structures behind some of the bioterror era's conspiracies. And then there is the connections. One of the most important modern organizations for understanding where Resident Evil is heading. The connections bridge the old world and the new one. They tie the mode era to the wider black market bioweapon economy and represent what post Umbrella horror looks like. Decentralized, hard to map, global, and willing to exploit any biological system that offers power. All of these organizations show the same thing. The horror never survives by accident. It survives because someone always has a reason to keep it alive. Resident Evil has never just been about viruses, monsters, and survival. Under all the laboratories, conspiracies, and outbreaks, it is also a story built on symbols, evolution, rebirth, inheritance, contamination, memory, and the arrogance of human beings trying to control life itself. The most obvious symbol in the franchise is the umbrella logo. Village changes the meaning of that logo by revealing that Spencer took the idea for Umbrella's name and symbol from the cave where he studied with Mother Miranda. That means the logo is not just branding, it is a fossil of hidden prehistory behind the whole series. Progenitor is not just the origin virus in the lore, it is the symbolic origin of the franchise's obsession with accent. Spencer does not view Progenitor as merely dangerous biology. He views it as a ladder. It symbolizes forbidden transcendence, the idea that humanity has found a hidden mechanism for rewriting life and that someone arrogant enough might try to seize it. That same symbolic thread continues through Ouroboros. The serpent eating its own tail has long represented cycles, destruction and renewal, and self-transformation. In Resident Evil 5, Ouroboros perfectly expresses Wesker's belief that the old humanity must be consumed so a new one can emerge from the remains. Then the series changes shape again with the mode era. The mode era is not just another mutagen. It symbolizes memory, identity, and persistence after death. The megamycete stores memories and consciousness, which means infection becomes linked not just to mutation, but to selfhood surviving in corrupted form. Eveline becomes a twisted symbol of family and belonging, weaponized into control. Raccoon City is perhaps the single most important symbolic space in the entire franchise. On the plot level, it is the site of Umbrella's greatest public disaster. Symbolically, it is buried guilt, the corpse of the franchise's original lie. In Requiem, it becomes unfinished biological history. And then there's Elpis, which breaks the pattern. Everything about Resident Evil trains the audience to assume buried science means a stronger weapon. Elpis appears to fit that expectation. Then the true ending turns it inside out. Elpis is not escalation, it is interruption. Even its name evokes hope. That is why the title Requiem feels so perfect. A requiem is a mass for the dead, a ritual of mourning, remembrance, and reckoning. Resident Evil 9 feels like the franchise finally grieving its own history instead of just extending it. Once you see that, Resident Evil stops looking like a pile of disconnected biohazard plots and starts looking like one long symbolic story about humanity trying to dominate evolution and repeatedly discovering that the price is always more bodies, more grief, or more ghosts. If Resident Evil Requiem is a story about the scars left behind by Raccoon City, then its characters are the living proof that those scars never healed cleanly. Every major person in RE9 carries a different fragment of the franchise's history. Grace Ashcroft is the emotional center of Resident Evil 9. She is an FBI analyst, the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, and the inheritor of trauma she never lived through firsthand. Her purpose in RE9 is to investigate the deaths linked to Renwood Hotel. But her deeper mission is to uncover what really happened to her mother and why the old Raccoon City nightmare has started moving again. Leon S. Kennedy is the other half of the story. He is one of the survivors of Raccoon City and now a seasoned DSO agent. His purpose is to embody memory. Grace investigates the past. Leon has been living with it for nearly 30 years. His mission in Requiem is to investigate the chain of deaths, but on a deeper level, he is there because he can recognize exactly what kind of horror is returning. Alyssa Ashcroft haunts the plot. Her death at Renwood is the event that pulls Grace into the mystery, and her history with Umbrella turns the case into something much bigger than one hotel and one body. Nathan Dempsey represents the procedural side of the opening, the last moment where the story still looks like a solvable crime. Emily is the emotional anchor who makes Elpis feels personal rather than abstract. Sherry Birkin, she connects the new mystery back to one of the ugliest branches of Umbrella's history. Gideon personifies the survival of Umbrella's scientific arrogance in human form. Zeno represents the opportunistic hunger of the post-Umbrella world. Every one of them has a purpose in RE9, and every one of them is carrying some different fragment of the franchise's larger history. By the time Requiem reaches Elpis, the story has already trained the audience to fear it. It sounds like another hidden project, another buried experiment, another final gift from Umbrella's worst instincts. Gideon wants it, Zeno wants it. Everything about the setup tells you Elpis must be a weapon. That assumption is exactly what makes the truth hit so hard. Elpis is not another virus, another tyrant program, or another mutagen designed to make stronger monsters. It is an antiviral agent, a cure. In the true ending, releasing Elpis cures Leon and opens the way to saving other infected characters, including Emily and Sherry. That immediately elevates Elpis from a major plot device to one of the most consequential biological discoveries in the entire franchise. What makes that even more powerful is who created it. Requiem frames Elpis as a late act of Spencer's repentance. That does not erase his evil, but it complicates his legacy. The same man who built Umbrella's empire of mutation and death apparently chose to hide away a cure. Elpis becomes Spencer's final contradiction. It does not elevate, it restores. It does not transform, it neutralizes. In that sense, Elpis is Spencer's confession in molecular form. That is why RE9 is such a turning point. Resident Evil usually escalates. Elpis interrupts. It threatens the old biological order of the franchise itself. If it can truly neutralize the infection that shaped Resident Evil's history, then the series is no longer building only towards stronger outbreaks, it is finally imagining restoration. One of the most important ideas in Resident Evil Requiem is that Umbrella may be gone as a corporation, but it is not gone as a system. The real danger of Umbrella was never just the company itself, it was the worldview behind it, the infrastructure it built, and the way its science survived after its legal death. Blue Umbrella already proves that the Umbrella identity can survive in altered form. Arc proves that hidden Umbrella infrastructures still has the power to shape the present. Gideon proves that Umbrella type scientists still exist, still think the same way, and still pursue the same fantasy of dominating mutation. Zeno proves that the post Umbrella world is full of opportunists ready to seize whatever the old machine left behind. That is what makes RE9 feel like it is pointing towards an Umbrella return in a new form. The threat is no longer one monolithic company with one logo and one headquarters. The threat is a distributed ecosystem of successor figures, buried facilities, compromised institutions, and inherited research. Umbrella returns not as one body, but as a network. After Elpis, the question is no longer just whether the hero can survive. The question becomes what kind of world emerges if Umbrella's nightmare can be cured, inherited, or reborn all at once. Resident Evil 9 is not just another entry. What makes it so important is that it changes the scale at which the audience is asked to understand Resident Evil. Instead of treating the franchise like a chain of separate incidents, Requiem makes the whole series feel like one continuous biological history. It turns scattered lore into one long wound, and at the center of that wound is Umbrella's obsession with rewriting life. Requiem reconnects the classic era to the modern one in a way no other game has done this cleanly. The Mansion Incident, Raccoon City, Birkin's Research, Nemesis, The Fall of Umbrella, Las Plagas, Boros, The Sea Virus, The Mode, Miranda, Eveline, Blue Umbrella, The Connections, all of it begins to look less like disconnected lore and more like chapters in the same unfinished experiment. Grace is crucial because she embodies second generation Fallout. Leon is crucial because he is one of the clearest surviving links to the classic era. Elpis is crucial because it threatens the logic of endless escalation. Together, those elements make Requiem feel like a memorable chapter, a reckoning, and a turning point all at once. That is the real reason Resident Evil 9 matters to the entire franchise. It is the chapter that forces everything into one frame. The old labs, the old viruses, the parasites, the mold, the corporations, the successor groups, the bloodlines, the survivor trauma, the symbols, the lies, the hope. Requiem gathers all of it together and says this was never random. This was one long story, one long experiment, one long inheritance of biological violence that began with Spencer and kept mutating through every era that followed. Resident Evil Requiem, at its core, is a story about scars. The scars left by Raccoon City, Umbrella, Spencer's belief that humanity could be improved through infection, and the scars carried forward by the people who survived all of it. Whether they remember the nightmare firsthand, like Leon, or inherit it secondhand, like Grace. That is why Resident Evil 9 matters so much. It is not just another sequel, it is the chapter where the series reveals what it has really been about the whole time. Not simply monsters and outbreaks, but the human consequences of trying to control evolution. And that is where Elpis becomes the most important symbol in the entire game. Elpis is not just a cure, it is a disruption. It is the first major force in Resident Evil that does not push the nightmare forward, but threatens to break its pattern. In the true ending, Elpis cures Leon, opens the way to saving Emily and Sherry, and reveals itself as an antiviral rather than the super weapon nearly everyone assumes it must be. But Requiem does not give us a clean ending. Even if Elpis offers healing, the final notes of the story makes it clear that healing does not end the struggle. Hidden forces are still moving through the wreckage of Ark. That means the disease may no longer be the only prize. Now the cure is a prize too. Based on what Requiem reveals, the most likely future of the series is a post-Umbrella, but still Umbrella era. Not a world where the old corporation simply returns with the same logo, but a world where Umbrella's system survives through successor groups, hidden facilities, compromised institutions, and new players trying to seize control of both infection and cure. I also think the connections are positioned to become even more important. They already bridge the mode era with the wider black market bioweapon world. And RE9 puts that kind of opportunist power directly in orbit around Elpis. If Umbrella was the original architect of biological horror, the connections may be best positioned to inherit the modern version of that power. If Elpis truly works the way Requiem suggests, the next phase of Resident Evil may not be defined by a stronger virus, a stronger parasite, or a deadlier mode mutation. It may be defined by the struggle over who controls the answer. The next great Resident Evil conflict might not be about the next outbreak, it might be about whether the world is allowed to heal at all. That is why Requiem feels so powerful. It is not just a story about another outbreak. It is a story about the inheritance, the memory, the biological violence passed from one era to the next, and whether the nightmare that began with Spencer can ever truly be ended, or whether it simply keeps returning in new forms, wearing new faces, and waiting for the world to make the same mistake again. The nightmare never truly ended. It simply waited.